Hello everyone, my name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and you're here joining us on our latest edition of the On Tour series of videos that we've been doing. For this month's On Tour, we're highlighting three of the objects that are on loan to us from the National Museum of Health and Medicine. And those are bones from Civil War soldiers that were wounded in the Antietam campaign. We're highlighting three of their stories in these videos. And in this video, we're going to be talking about Richard Perry Hughes of the 50th Georgia. And he was wounded right here in this field at the Battle of South Mountain. Now, the Battle of South Mountain is sort of three mini battles in one. We actually did a previous series of on tour videos about the Battle of South Mountain, and you can find that playlist on our YouTube channel. We're going to be focusing on the Battle of Fox's Gap. So there's Turner's Gap and then Crampton's Gap, all of which are fought on the same day, more or less at the same time. But Fox's Gap, which is where we are right now, is what we're going to focus on. Now, the Union Army is sort of attempting to take these gaps in the mountain pass in an attempt to foil Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. The Confederate Army are holding these three mountain passes, and so the Union Army is heading that direction in that way, whereas the Confederates are they're generally facing this way, trying to prevent the Union defenders from taking the mountain passes. Now, the fighting here at Fox's Gap had been raging since 9 or 9:30 in the morning. There'd been a lot of fighting, but by the time the soldier we're talking about, Richard Hughes and the 50th Georgia, by the time they arrive on the battlefield, it's getting on towards 2 o'clock. So the fighting had been happening just about all day by the time that they arrived. And the 50th Georgia is part of Drayton's brigade. And they are going to occupy the far left flank of the Confederate force here at Fox's Gap. And eventually, Drayton saw a Union attack coming kind of off in that direction, and rather than stay facing straight on like this, Drayton's men wheeled such that they were facing this way so that they could perhaps lay down some flanking fire on the Union attackers coming off in that direction. But what they did not know about is that there were a few other Union regiments straight off in this direction. So now Richard Hughes and the 50th Georgia are exposed on the left flank of the brigade there. So the 17th Michigan, and there's a small little plaque to the 17th Michigan just behind the cameras here because they do the lion's share of the fighting in this field. The 17th Michigan ends up attacking the flank and rear of the 50th Georgia and the 51st Georgia, routing both units, and ultimately the rest of Drayton's brigade end up falling back through the mountain pass here, and Union soldiers end up taking control of the South Mountain battlefield here at Fox's Gap, and ultimately at all three locations. The Battle of South Mountain is a pretty important victory for the Union in that they occupy this territory. South Mountain is fought on September 14th, 1862, just a few days later. The bloodiest single day in American history, the Battle of Antietam, September 17th. And the other two wounded soldiers that we highlight in this series of videos were wounded at Antietam. You can check out the playlist for these videos for more information on those people. But getting back to Richard Hughes here, the 50th Georgia suffers quite heavily. They take fire, as I mentioned, from the 17th Michigan in their left flank and in the rear, and as well as from the 45th and the 100th Pennsylvania from their front. They really get sandwiched, and they quickly retreat, and they end up suffering about 76% casualties. So an overwhelming number of killed and wounded are left behind. And one of those, of course, is Richard Hughes. He was only 21 when he enlisted in March of 1862 into the 50th Georgia, and he was shot in the forehead, the left portion of the forehead. And several years ago at the museum, we actually had full-scale replicas of the bones that we currently have on display made. So I have that replica with me here today, so this is not an actual bone, never fear. But as you can see, in his left forehead, there's a pretty sizable hole there. fact that he's shot on his left side further confirms, what we might expect. He was probably shot by someone in the 17th Michigan, given that he's on the left flank and there's fire coming from the left and rear. So he takes a shot there. As if this weren't enough, a second bullet hits him in the left arm, just below the shoulder, fracturing his humerus, and the bullet exits through the scapula, which is kind of the shoulder bone back there, doing more damage to his left shoulder area. He's not left in very good shape, with a wound, in his forehead and in his left arm. He's left on the field, and if you can believe that, despite all of this, Mr. Hughes manages to survive. So he's not killed instantly, despite being shot in the head. It's hard to say how many people during the Civil War could say that, but he is one of them. From here, the details get a little bit fuzzy. He's left out here on the field for an undetermined amount of time. So we've talked often on this channel about the Letterman system. The Letterman plan. Jonathan Letterman was a Union surgeon, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. And the Letterman plan is a whole system of medical evacuation designed to care for wounded soldiers the moment they're injured, all the way through long-term recovery. But he was a Union surgeon, and the Battle of South Mountain is the first time that this system gets employed. It's hard to say what the Confederates would have deployed. It would have been a little bit less systematized than what the Union Army was using at South Mountain and Antietam. But of course, they're not around to occupy the battlefield, so he would have been relying upon Union ambulances and such. So it's unclear how long he remained on the field, somewhere out here in the field behind me. It's very likely that he would have been treated at the nearby Wise cabin. So that no longer stands today, but it was located just a little bit behind the camera here, maybe 100 yards or so. And that was a field hospital, we know. And we know of course, one Union soldier at least that was treated there, Henry Tisdale. We did a video on him for our on-tour series when we talked about South Mountain. So we'll put the link for that video in the description if you want to know. It's very likely that Richard Hughes was treated there as well. And that despite all of these pretty serious wounds, wound to the shoulder and wound to the skull here, he was eventually taken to Frederick, likely when he was well enough to travel, because these field hospitals on the battlefield here, they're not purpose-built, and the goal is to quickly get the wounded out from there as soon as they can. But we do know that eventually Hughes was brought to Frederick, and he was sent to General Hospital number 1, and he checks in there on October 27th, about a month and a half after his wounding. So he's sticking around for a while, and we'll pick up the story there next. The reason why we know all of this information has to do with the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, initiated by sitting Federal Surgeon General William Hammond. He says that surgeons that find anything interesting should send case reports to him and medical specimens if applicable. And the incentive was that they would then be published after the war. What doctor doesn't like to be published? And so that's how we have this. And they're recording Union case histories as well as Confederate case histories. So that's how we have a lot of this information. And that's why the details start to get a little bit more clear when our patients come into contact with Union surgeons, because they're the ones that are going to be doing the reporting and the case histories and such. So it wasn't until about a month and a half after the initial wounding that Hughes was well enough to make the journey to Frederick. Since he's already on top of the mountain, he doesn't have to endure the wagon ride up and down the mountain to Frederick, just the wagon ride down. So the trip would have been probably half a day or so to get from here to General Hospital number 1. That's where we're going to pick up his story next. See you in just a second. So here we are now on the campus, the modern-day campus of the Maryland School for the Deaf, what was, at the time of the Civil War, General Hospital number 1. General Hospital number 1, the vast majority of it no longer stands. It was a pretty wide campus that stretched, well, basically pretty much all where the modern-day campus of Maryland School for the Deaf stretches. The structure you see behind me is the only remnant of that. That was the Hessian barracks, and this building dates actually to the 1700s, to the Revolutionary War era. This is where German Hessian prisoners were kept, hence the derisively named Hessian barracks. And so this was part of the General Hospital Number 1 complex. Likely surgeons would have boarded and bunked there. And it's also the site where Confederate soldier Richard Hughes was brought. He was wounded at the Battle of South Mountain on September 14th, 1862, who I mentioned again. We have a replica of the bone that we have in the museum, or on display in the museum with me here. He was brought here on October 27th, 1862, about a month and a half after his wounding. General Hospital Number 1 here in Frederick had a capacity of between 700 and 800 total patients at a time. So it was, again, a pretty large facility. And throughout the entire Civil War, this place was open from 1861 all the way through 1865. Over 30,000 patients came through here at some point. So this was an active site long before and long after the Antietam campaign. Some of the other hospital sites here in Frederick, which we're going to visit in just a moment, these were more temporary constructions established in the aftermath of the battles of Antietam and South Mountain. But this is purpose-built to be a hospital. By the time Richard Hughes arrived here, he was, according to the medical and surgical history, again, that kind of case report that I mentioned earlier, we have all this information because case reports and detailed bureaucracy and such, they're taking careful notes on his condition. So as the medical and surgical history says, he was, quote, in a very low condition and suffering from diarrhea. So as if being shot in the forehead and the kind of left shoulder area wasn't enough, he was having some acute diarrhea symptoms as well. Tonics and stimulants were freely given in an attempt to treat him, in addition, of course, to bandaging the wounds and such. There was not an amputation done of the arm because, as best as they could determine, that wound was a fracture and not a shatter. So they put a splint on his arm. We have Civil War era splints in our collection as well. So just further emphasizing that even though amputation is the most common surgical procedure of the war, it was not done in all instances. The doctors are kind of carefully assessing what should or shouldn't be done. A splint is put on him. He's being given tonics and stimulants, but they didn't note any symptoms of paralysis, brain compression, or cerebral disturbance. But both of his wounds were infected, and they were discharging some pus. Now, in the world before germ theory, basically every Civil War injury grew to be infected at some point. And from the account, both of his wounds were, because as they say, profuse and unhealthy discharge from the wounds soon weakened Mr. Hughes here. And he eventually died from his wounds, likely from the infection that was caused in both of the wound locations on November 25th, 1862. So about 2.5 months after being shot in the forehead and in the shoulder, he ends up passing away, as they put it, from exhaustion, but again, almost certainly from infections from his wounds. From here, after his death, he is buried over in the nearby Mount Olivet Cemetery, and we're going to head there soon. It was quite common for soldiers who died here at General Hospital Number 1 to be buried in Mount Olivet. The Confederate soldiers, many of them are still buried there. Many of the Union soldiers who died here, hospitals in Frederick, were initially buried in Mount Olivet, but later were sent either back to their hometowns or to Antietam National Cemetery, more likely than not. So we're going to head over to Mount Olivet now. Here we are at the grave site of Richard Perry Hughes, or R.P. Hughes as he's identified here. We're in Mount Olivet Cemetery. We've traveled, I don't know, maybe a third of a mile, half a mile or so from where we were at General Hospital Number 1. He is grave 174 here, although there is an error. His death date on the headstone is listed as November 5th, when he actually died on November 25th. So I guess they forgot to add the 2 on there. And that's noted his death date, not just in the medical and surgical history, but there's a recent book that just came out all about Confederate Row, which is where we are right now, Confederate Row, Mount Olivet, which also notes that inaccuracy. This is where 305 individual graves and 1 mass grave of 408 Confederate dead are buried from the battles of South Mountain, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Monocacy. So battles fought relatively near to here at Frederick. Now, Mount Olivet Cemetery itself originated in 1852 and had its first burials just days after being officially dedicated on May 23rd, 1854. Mount Olivet is much larger than just Confederate Row here. It's home to a host of famous and not as famous Frederictonians, highlighted by Francis Scott Key as well as Barbara Fritchie, and many others who are not quite as well known as they are. Confederate Row, of course, begins in the days after the Battle of South Mountain, which was fought September 14th, 1862, which is where Richard Hughes was wounded at the Battle of Fox's Gap within South Mountain, as we talked about earlier. Burials start happening in those kind of days of mid to late September. Hughes stuck around until November, and generally speaking, the chronological dates of death kind of go up as you move along. There are a few exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's the rule here. Initially, when the Confederate dead were buried, you see there's a few different headstones here. Before there was any stone of any kind, initially it was just a wooden headboard, just to kind of mark their graves and identify them if they are known. Eventually, stone markers followed, and somewhat more recently, we have these kind of newly updated and much more legible grave markers. As you'll note if you come visit here, some of the original grave markers, the stones anyway, can be very hard to read. There are other Civil War dead from both sides, both Confederate and Union, buried in family plots. So these are not the only Civil War veterans buried here in Mount Olivet, but these are basically people who are treated in hospitals in Frederick, more often than not General Hospital No. 1, where we just came from, and they're all sort of buried together here, Richard Hughes being among them. So this is where Richard's journey ends, along with several hundred other Confederates here. So the bones that we have on display from the National Museum of Health and Medicine, which were sent to the Army Medical Museum, were sent there to be preserved such that we can learn something from the Civil War dead, that we can go on to make medical advancements in the future, and that these dead shall not have died in vain. That brings the story of Richard Hughes to a close. Thank you so much for being with us today. We have another couple stories of wounded soldiers from the Antietam campaign in this edition of our On Tour playlist. If you like this video, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date to the latest what we're doing. That's a great way to support us. And if you want to take your support one step farther, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We'd really appreciate it. It helps support programming like this.